Welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine. What does this war mean from a historical perspective in that part of the world? We'll try to answer that question. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Jenks. Dr. Jenks is a professor of history with a specialization in Russian history. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, regular viewers of this program will recognize that you and I have been on the show together several times talking about Russian history, especially the history of Russia as it relates to the relationship Russia has had with the United States. But today it's a little bit different. We're going to be talking about Russia and its neighbor Ukraine. And I want to start and stipulate here at the beginning that when Vladimir Putin decided to roll his tanks and troops and artillery across that border into the sovereign soil of Ukraine, most of us, probably all of us, were shocked at this development. It seemed inconceivable that we could have an actual land war like this in Europe, reminiscent of what happened in World War II, but it seems, in fact, that's what we have. And the invasion, the violence, the death, the destruction, the refugee crisis that's affecting millions across Eastern Europe, none of that is going to be justified or excused by any of the historical elements of conflict that we're going to talk about today. I just want to make that very clear for the audience's purpose. And so we condemn the violence. Invasion is never a good thing, but I think it's also important from a historical perspective and a context to talk about what has happened in that region for many, many years. So let's go ahead and go back to about 600 years ago when we have what's known as a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in that part of the world, especially in Ukraine, but there's conflict there with Russia. So briefly, if you will, explain what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was all about and why was that a problem for Russia?
Well, the origins of the divisions that we see in Ukraine actually go back to precisely the late 1500s and early 1600s. It's amazing how durable these historical roots are and how they manifest themselves so many centuries later. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was actually the most powerful state in Central Europe up through the late 1500s and early 1600s. Muscovy, that is to say the Russian state formation at that time, which was based in Moscow, did not include what we today would call Ukraine. Ukraine, what we today call Ukraine, was involved in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, as a result of the wars that Muscovy waged with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it acquired, by the mid-1600s, the eastern part of Ukraine. That is to say, that part of Ukraine that is in the east, Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, including Kiev, all the way up to Kiev. That became part of the Russian Empire by the mid-1600s. Now, the basic division in what we today call Ukraine was between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had persecuted the Orthodox subjects and attempted to forcibly convert them to Catholicism. The Orthodox subjects went to Moscow and said, help us out. And indeed, that's what Moscow did, and that's what resulted in the Polish-Lithuanian wars with Russia. Russia won that war, acquiring the eastern part of Ukraine and setting the stage for the decline of Poland and the increasing amalgamation of territory that we today call Ukraine into the Russian Empire.
And I think it's important to note that that conflict of East versus West, Orthodoxy in the East, Catholicism in the West, that's a root problem that exists to this day.
Oh, to this day, it's amazing. You can look at the divisions in Ukraine, that part of Ukraine that went into the Russian Empire in the mid-1600s, and is basically to this day the dividing line between those who speak primarily Russian versus, to the west, those who speak primarily Ukrainian. Those who are primarily Orthodox, which they share in common with the Russians in the east, and those who are primarily Catholic in the west. And in many ways, those fault lines define the conflict in Ukraine today, though with some interesting variations and developments.
Well, let's move forward. After the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was fractured, and it was, then we go to the Russians taking over much of Ukraine, what's known as Ukraine today, but we also have a sliver or slice of it that's controlled by the Austrian Habsburg Empire, as I understand it. How did that work out?
Well, in the reign of Catherine the Great, basically the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Prussia, and the Russian Empire gobbled up what was left of Poland in the so-called partitions of Poland. Russia got the biggest chunk, by far and away the biggest chunk, which included most of the rest of present-day Ukraine. The part that went to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, involved the extreme westernmost part of Ukraine, Lviv today, which is the center, by the way, of a more anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. So that's how most of the rest of Ukraine ended up in the Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm. And that Catholic split remained in that western part of Ukraine with the Orthodoxy in the east.
Well, it most certainly did,
Yeah.
and there were various attempts during the 19th century under the reign of Tsar Nicholas I to try to convert those Catholics who had been back to Orthodoxy. Many of the Orthodox subjects that converted to Catholicism in the 1600s and remained part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is to say, they were converted forcibly back to Orthodoxy in the 19th century.
Okay, so now we need to move along into World War I and, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the Bolsheviks, of course, won that revolution. They took over, they instituted communism, collectivization, and the Soviet Union. Ukraine becomes a member of the Soviet Union. How did collectivization, communism, and becoming a part of the Soviet Union impact Ukraine?
Well, during the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Civil War from 1918 to 1921, there was an independent Ukraine, socialist Ukraine, that emerged for a brief time, and that was put down and integrated into what became the Soviet Union in 1922. That is to say, a union of nominally independent national republics, including Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine did not have sovereignty. As the Soviet Union developed its policies of collectivization in the late 1920s, the idea was that we're going to herd all the peasants into collective farms, steal their grain, use that grain to feed the growing city that is being industrialized, and then also sell the grain on foreign markets in order to finance industrialization. Well, where was most of the grain, the breadbasket of Europe? Ukraine. That republic, Socialist Republic of Ukraine. So collectivization, its negative impact, the resistance to the policies, the starvation that resulted from looting and stealing the grain from peasants was focused primarily in Ukraine. And that gave rise to the idea that Stalin's policies of collectivization were a policy of genocide directed against Ukrainian peasantry and people.
And we call that era of the great starvation of 1932, 1933, roughly. Now we're talking about Joseph Stalin being in charge of the Soviet Union. And we call it the Holodomor. And explain a little bit about the Holodomor, how it actually happened. I know it's complicated and we don't have a lot of time, but if you could give us a sense of how that actually happened and why that engendered such resentment from Ukrainians toward the Soviet Union and Russia in particular.
Well, it was associated with the policy of collectivization. So you herd the peasants into collective farms, you steal their grain, those who resist you shoot, or you exile to Siberia. And it was a policy that was across the Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine. But it disproportionately affected Ukraine because Ukraine was the primary agricultural region of the Soviet Union. Now, many Ukrainian nationalists later on interpreted the policies of collectivization as something directed specifically against the Ukrainian people as a policy of genocide. Historically speaking, that's not really accurate. Because the policy of collectivization affected negatively peasants of any ethnicity within the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, when the independent state of Ukraine emerged in the 1990s, it created this kind of founding myth of martyrdom and suffering, sort of like the Holocaust helped to create the state of Israel. And in the Ukrainian case, it was the Holodomor, that there was this policy of genocide directed by the Soviets and by Moscow against Ukraine, and that its moment of independence in the 1990s was something that would prevent this from ever happening again. And that the idea of the Holodomor became the foundation of the educational system, right? The Ukrainian kids, when they go to school, what do they learn about their own past? That there were these Muscovites, the Moskali is a negative term that Ukrainians use for Muscovites that were perpetrating a policy of genocide designed to destroy the sovereignty and people of Ukraine and amalgamate them into Russia.
Well, now we need to move forward to the dawn of World War II, and that's when Hitler and his troops rolled through Ukraine on their way to Russia. Well, as it happens, many people in Western Ukraine were cheering on the German troops and Hitler, and actually, it's mind-boggling today to think about it, but they were actually cheering Hitler, and they saw him as some sort of liberator at that time. Why would they perceive Hitler as a liberator at that time?
Well, because Stalin was an imprisoner. And, Stalin has famously created this vast archipelago of prison camps, the Gulag that Solzhenitsyn talked about. Soviet Union was a pretty nasty place, and of course collectivization had created misery and impoverishment. So there were lots of reasons to hate the Soviet Union, particularly for many people who were prosperous peasants in Ukraine. So that fueled, I think, a sort of anticipation that the Nazis represented the invasion, a moment of liberation. And of course, they were disabused of those notions fairly early on, because Hitler treated all Slavic peoples as basically slaves that would be turned toward producing various goods and services for the Aryan nation. At any rate, there were a group of extreme anti-Russian nationalists in the West who allied themselves with the Nazis, the Ukrainian Liberation Army, and they fought against the Soviet army. And when the Nazis were defeated, they continued to fight for control, particularly in Western Ukraine, against Stalin. That was from 1946 to 1948. By the way, there were about 110,000 people who were killed after World War II in Ukraine as part of this conflict. Ultimately, they were defeated by Stalin's forces, and the ones that were not sent to the Gulag escaped to Canada. They escaped to the United States, Argentina, and many other places, and they continued to raise the banner of an anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. Now, if I may, to take this up to the present, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they came back. They came back. They're not all the forces that helped to create an independent Ukraine, but they are a portion of those forces, particularly strong in the western parts of Ukraine that I talked about before, historically speaking, that part of Ukraine, which is much more anti-Russian than the eastern part of Ukraine. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there are those far-right forces that have this lineage that goes back to the collaborators with Nazis during World War II. Hence, Putin's seemingly ridiculous idea that this is a campaign of denazification. It really is not accurate to say that, but there are people who make heroes out of those who fought alongside the Nazis against Stalin's army.
Now, at that point, we need to go to the break. When we come back from the break, we'll continue this conversation about the war in Ukraine. We'll focus on what's happening today. See you in a moment.
Baby, you see, I cannot set you free. My lonely days are gone. That's why I'm never gonna let you go. Never gonna let you go. Babe, I'm never gonna let you go. No, no, never gonna let you go.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Never gonna let you go. Never gonna let you go.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Andrew Jenks. We're talking about the war in Ukraine. And Andrew, before the break, you briefly mentioned that Putin has used the excuse or the rationale that he's doing a denazification program in Ukraine. I want to talk about that for just a moment. And there does seem to be some people, it's nowhere near a majority, that do have some what are referred to as ultranationalists or even somewhat neo-Nazi type leanings. How much of a faction, how much of a percentage of the population would that entail roughly, and do they wield any power within the Ukraine?
Well, I think it's hard to identify exactly a particular percentage of them, but a significant minority, particularly the further west you go in Ukraine. There's an identification with many of the people who resisted Soviet power, even those who collaborated with the Nazis. So there is a grain of truth in the idea that that there is a Nazi sort of connection somehow in present-day Ukraine, although it's not expressed through the ideas and the ideology of President Zelensky, that's for sure, right? But those are forces in Ukraine on the ground that will play a role in whatever outcome to this war there will be. And by the way, the more successful the Ukrainian forces are against Russian forces, the more emboldened will those right-wing forces become, presenting therefore a problem for Zelensky in making a compromise and a peace with Putin.
Okay, well, let's move on in our historical analysis here. Around 1991 or 92, when the Soviet Union was broken up and dissolved, Ukraine did have its independence. It became a sovereign country at that point in time. And they did have supporters in the West. They've been encouraged by the West. And in Putin's mind, this is a red line, Ukraine and NATO. And NATO kept moving into those Eastern European countries and one by one turning them into NATO-aligned countries. Why is Ukraine the red line for Putin in this case?
Well, historically speaking, of course, Putin believes that Ukraine is something that needs to be associated in one political system with Russia, along with Belarus and many of the other former nations of the Soviet Union and of the Russian Empire. That's one reason. But the other issue has to do with creating new security structures in Europe. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany was unified. The problem that had fueled the Cold War seemed to be over. And there was a desperate need to create a new kind of security architecture or structure that would include Russia and not exclude Russia. So there were discussions about getting rid of NATO, which after all was created to prevent an invasion by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union no longer exists, ergo no reason for NATO anymore. The United States actually entertained that possibility. George Kennan, the architect of the policy of containment in the early 1990s, famously said the biggest mistake the United States could make would be to retain and expand NATO. That would be the biggest blunder it could make. Well, what did we do? We retained NATO. What is the problem with NATO? Well, from a Russian point of view, and I've talked with many Russians on my trips to Russia over the years, NATO's purpose is to oppose Russia and to expand Western influence into areas that are on the border with Russia. Given the fact that 28 to 30 million people died during World War II as a result of occupation and invasion, Russians have an extreme and legitimate fear of invasion coming from the Western borders, a kind of invasion psychosis. So security at all costs on the Western borders is essential. And of course, Ukraine, which means, by the way, in Russian, Ukraina, in Russian means at the border. So Ukraine is the Western borderland that needs to be secured in the Russian consciousness. And not securing it and having NATO expand into these areas will trigger this invasion psychosis and this feeling of profound insecurity. Putin came to power pledging to provide security and strength and power for Russia. The continuing expansion of NATO through the 2000s was a thumb in his eye and in his claim of providing security to his people. So this was an existential problem as he saw it for Russia. NATO had to be neutralized.
Hence his insistence that Ukraine must be neutral and cannot be aligned with NATO politically.
Absolutely. And you know, if you look at through the 2000s, when Putin came into power in 1999-2000, he was far more oriented toward making peace with the West. And he entertained the possibility, and he actually asked about this, if Russia could be included in NATO and the security structures. And he was denied that possibility. And subsequently, through the 2000s, NATO relentlessly expanded into former countries that were part of the former Soviet Union. Each time another country joined NATO, leading all the way up to the possibility of Ukraine most recently joining NATO, Putin became more anti-Western, more oriented toward ideologies that would turn away from Western democratic values. And to me, this suggests that we played a role, at least in some level, in creating Putin as our enemy.
So what Putin has done essentially now is turn to the east. And now we're going to talk about Eurasianism. And he's aligned with China. President Xi and Putin have been seen together in recent months, signing agreements, mostly involving energy and natural resources and food security and that sort of thing. So he has a big ally there with China. Is this alliance going to enable a new kind of Eurasianism? First of all, please identify what Eurasianism means, why this is attractive to Putin, and is China going to go along with this?
Well, Eurasianism is, briefly, in the 1920s, conservative Russian imperialists that were associated with the Russian Empire and lost in their fight against the Bolsheviks during the Bolshevik Revolution, emigrated to the West. And in emigration, they began to develop this idea of Eurasianism, which basically said it's Russia's destiny to create a civilization, an empire that would encompass all of Eurasia, sort of Poland to Mongolian space, let's say. And that would be a part of Russia's patrimony. And it would be based on Russian orthodoxy, and it would be opposed to Western liberal democratic values, a reaction against the sort of Enlightenment liberal democratic values that had created the United States, Great Britain, and France in their liberal sort of guises. It was an alternative to the West. Putin had been flirting with these ideas, which became very popular again in the 1990s and 2000s, to the point where basically he has adopted Eurasianism as the ideology that has replaced communism now. And in many ways, it is what justifies the invasion of Ukraine, to protect Ukraine from the penetration and perversion by Western democratic secular values. Putin wants to maintain Ukraine within that orbit of Eurasia. Of course, many Ukrainians don't want to have anything to do with it. And so this is a vast sort of landmass, right, that stretches all the way from Central Europe and then eastward across the Ural Mountains into the Pacific Ocean, all the way to the Amur River basin, which separates China from Russia. And in order to make this viable now, particularly because of the sanctions and the increasing isolation from the West, Russia has to turn to China. This is a dangerous game, mostly for Russia.
I would think that China would have the upper hand
in
that kind of arrangement. Population, economic influence across the world, productive capacity. Russia provides natural resources, and then China takes.
Oh yeah. So if you go to the Amur River basin, which separates China from Russia, that was land that Russia took from China in the 1890s. China wants it back, by the way, to the north of the Amur River basin. And they're probably getting it back, but in their own way, by controlling it economically. It used to be that the Chinese side was utterly undeveloped and backwards, and the Russian side, relatively speaking, was far more developed. Now if you go to the Amur River basin and look across from Russia, you'll see skyscrapers, you'll see bustling economic activity, and you will see a one-way movement of timber and all sorts of other resources from Siberia across the Amur River into China. What's on the Russian side? Alcoholism, impoverishment, very, very sparse population. And you look at that dynamic, the relationship between the Russian side and the Chinese side in the Amur River basin, you can understand who has the upper hand, and it's not Russia.
Going forward, how do you think this relationship is going to play out with China and Russia?
One of the things that fascinates me about Chinese empire is its practicality. And what I mean by that is that the Chinese seem to have economic practical goals in mind. So they're willing to expand their military power and their political influence only to the extent that it works for them economically. Their economic interest in the United States are far greater than their economic interest in Russia. In other words, they have far more to lose by allying themselves closely with Russia than they have to gain. And I think Putin must know that, right? And so China's willing to go along and continue to get those resources from Siberia in order to fuel its continued economic growth. But I think there's going to be a real limit to the extent, about the extent to which they would be willing to hitch their train to Putin's crazy Eurasianism.
There might be Eurasianism, but it may not be Putin in charge, I guess is what we're,
Yes.
what we're basically coming to in this discussion. Well, we're starting to run out of time now, Andrew, but there are a couple of key things I want to make sure we get to. And one is the political realities in Russia and also in Ukraine. Now, the media narrative has been that Zelensky is the Churchillian figure of the West. He's residing or presiding over this Western-style European democracy and so forth, but that's not entirely true. And on the other side, Putin is he is the evil invader with the dark purpose, with an insatiable need for conquest. What's wrong with that picture on both sides?
Well, I'll start with the Russian side. What's wrong with that picture on the Russian side is that Putin is, if we think about this ideology of Eurasianism, he's pursuing sort of a vision of Russia as conservative, authoritarian empire, right? And it's conceivable to me that one could acquire influence in Ukraine without having to invade it. So in other words, that Putin is expressing an ideology and basing his actions upon it in ways that are perfectly logical, right? They're not evil. They're just an expression of a particular vision of Russia's place in the world and what he needs to do to secure that place and his own power. Ukraine. Ukraine is a post-Soviet state. What does that mean? It, like Russia, had the oligarchs, it had the corruption, it had the inefficiencies, it had the waste of resources, it had the political instability, and that has been the story of Ukraine really since its formation as an independent state after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Zelensky himself has this, as you put it, this Churchill moment, where people rallied behind him under the banner of national security. His ratings, by the way, were going down before the invasion. So he's used this as an opportunity to consolidate his power, but what is there that's nipping at his heels that constitutes a potential threat? And that is the far-right forces in Ukraine, emboldened by Ukrainian military successes. They will prevent him from being able, I think, to make a peace with Russia that Putin will accept. What does that mean? That means that the war will continue. As it continues, Zelensky will be challenged, his authority and his power, more and more and more. Zelensky needs this peace, but I'm not sure that he's in a political position to be able to get it, precisely because of the continuing divisions within Ukraine. Just one last point about corruption.
We're running out of time here.
It is, I don't want to say it's laughable, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense to view Zelensky as a freedom fighter. He represents a political option in Ukraine that will most certainly lean toward authoritarianism rather than toward liberal democratic values.
And on that note, which unfortunately is a somber note, we're going to have to close the program because we've run out of time. But thank you, Andrew, for being here today. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for watching. Join us again soon for the next edition of Talking Points. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.